Millions more than ever before are fleeing their homes. In the 20 years before 2011, there were an estimated 40 million refugees worldwide. Today, that number has almost tripled. As more and more displaced people continue searching for safety across the globe, will there ever be enough support for refugees and asylum seekers? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the global displacement crisis. As a result of persecution, conflict, violence, and human rights violations, there are now more displaced people than ever before. Russia's invasion of Ukraine saw 5.7 million people flee their homes, the fastest outflow of refugees anywhere since World War II. The numbers escaping Afghanistan also rose, as did those from Colombia, Peru, and Venezuela. Now, astoundingly, the 46 least developed nations, accounting for less than 1.3% of global GDP, host more than 20% of all refugees. So is enough being done by developed nations to help? Let's take a closer look.
This month, the UN Refugee Agency released its annual report, and the numbers are alarming. As of the end of 2022, more than 108 million people around the world were displaced. 19 million of them were forced out last year alone, the biggest annual increase since records began in 1975. The steep rise has been attributed to the war in Ukraine, the crisis in Afghanistan, and fighting in Sudan. Of the total refugees in need of international protection, half of them came from those three countries.
Last year we lived in Kyiv and it's totally destroyed, so we have we actually got kite surfing equipment. That's all we have, and laptops, and this is our clothes. Yeah. So we have to rebuild our life from bottom to from very beginning, and it's extremely. I mean, my sorry, I'm even shaking when I talk about this.
And there's no sign of reprieve. The UNHCR estimates that figure will exceed 110 million during the first 5 months of this year. That's 1 in every 74 people globally.
Last year, when we announced that for the first time we had gone over 100 million displaced people, well, already 10% more have been added to this figure. It's quite an indictment on the state of our world, if I may say, to have to report that.
Most people fleeing conflict and persecution stay close to home. 70% of refugees are hosted by neighboring countries. Syrians account for almost a fifth of all refugees, and over 3/4 of them, 3.5 million, reside in Turkey. But not all countries are as welcoming. In Eastern Europe, Poland and Hungary have refused to take anyone from the mainly Muslim Middle East and North Africa, with an anti-immigration rhetoric being fueled by politicians. The United Kingdom is currently pushing through new legislation that will prevent anyone arriving in small boats across the English Channel from claiming asylum.
We cannot go to a world in which responsibility sharing means some states keep all the refugees and some states pay all the money. We cannot do that. That's why we have resettlement. That's why we have different type of partnership. That's why asylum has to remain in reality in all parts of the world, including in the rich countries, and even more in the rich countries that have so many responsibilities.
So is there an answer to this growing problem? In 2022, only around 6 million refugees returned to their countries of origin, just a fraction of those that would choose to go home if they could. Until we can find a global solution to the root causes, it's unlikely that there will be a change in the rising number of refugees. The issue is complex and fraught, and often surrounded by a rhetoric of xenophobia and fear. And it seems the issue will remain until governments find long-term solutions to ending the conflicts and persecution that forced people to flee in the first place.
So how has it gotten this bad for displaced people around the world? Well, joining me now to help answer that is from Geneva, the UNHCR's Deputy High Commissioner, Kelly T. Clements. Thanks so much for being with us. Did you ever expect to see numbers like this? Or was it, thought that years ago the world had better mechanisms to, at the very least, prevent some of the conditions that have been forcing people to flee like this?
Well, quite simply, no. We didn't expect to see people moving in such large numbers, especially the numbers that you're talking about are because of war, conflict, violence, persecution. And we don't just see it in one or two regions of the world, we see it in every region of the world. And it has really skyrocketed. And let me just say before we go into some of the trend lines, behind every one of those over 108 million, now 110 million people, if you put in what's happened in Sudan in the last 2 months, is a person, a story, a family. They've had loss, they've had heartache, they've lost their possessions, they've had family members killed. They're quite literally running for their lives in certain locations. And this is something that we have to keep in mind when we talk about the massive challenge that is forced displacement. And they are really the symptoms of what's not going well in the world today. The lack of political solutions, the issues related to discrimination, racism, war. Like I said, inside Sudan, that is not something that we envisioned just a year ago or 2 years ago, when it looked like this was a country where people were going to be returning to, where people were going to rebuild. And so it is a trend line, obviously, that we would not want to see now in terms of the ability to be able to respond to those needs, and for people to be supported in the places, in the countries where they find themselves in this situation right now in the globe. It's really unfathomable.
Yeah, and that support is a huge problem, because there's this massive issue of how refugees and asylum seekers are being treated and received by other countries. I mean, you in particular had remarked about how you were so pleased, actually, to see the welcoming, the open arms that so many, especially European countries, welcomed Ukrainians with. You go from countries like Afghanistan and Syria, it is not the same.
Yes, no, well, it really depends on a whole lot of support. And in the case of Ukraine last year, I mean, we all remember those images where in single days there would be over 200,000 people leaving Ukraine, again, trying to find everything from a place to sleep to a way to be able to support their families. In other parts of the world, you see similar sorts of generosity.
One of the other solutions, or two of the other solutions that the UN listed, was voluntary repatriation and resettlement into a third country, which kind of surprised me. I mean, voluntary repatriation seems rather obvious. If people want to go back, they can go back. But resettlement to a third country has been quite controversial, yet it is one of the UN's now listed solutions to this crisis.
So there are three what we call durable solutions: the voluntary returns, local integration, where people, if they can't go back, they may find themselves in asylum locations, some of them for generations or decades. There's a legal way for people to be integrated. And then third country resettlement, which is really a solution of a form of international protection for a very small, most vulnerable refugees, where they can't go back, they can't locally integrate, and countries basically offer them these particular forms of protection.
Where has that worked so far?
We have, of course, now the United States that has come back to the table after several years where the resettlement was almost non-existent, where they have offered 125,000 places for refugees. But let's keep in mind, there are 35 million refugees in the world, so we're still talking about a solution for very few. So we would need much more of this kind of support going forward in some of the most intractable situations. But it certainly is a solution that many rely on.
How hopeful are you that you will get that support?
Well, in fact, we're here in Geneva as we're doing this interview. There is a global gathering of resettlement countries, of agencies that help to integrate and receive refugees, and we see that kind of generosity increasing. We'd like to sustain that. We'd like to build on it, and we'd like to see it grow, not just for resettlement, but also what we call other complementary pathways: labor mobility, for example, humanitarian visas, scholarships. We have seen a large number of offerings from some countries to offer places for refugee students to actually get an education. So there are many forms of solutions now that we look to try to help to address the situation.
Okay, Kelly T. Clements, unfortunately, we are completely out of time. I'd like to thank you so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Let's broaden out the discussion now and welcome three new panelists. Joining me from Reading in the UK is Ruvi Ziegler, an associate professor of international refugee law at Reading University. From Geneva, UNHCR spokesperson Olga Sarrado Mur, and from London is Ben Harris-Quinney, the chairperson of the conservative think tank, the Bow Group. Thanks all so much for being with us. So, Ruvi, with these kind of unbelievable numbers of displaced refugees and asylum seekers, are there any examples of good, working, sound policy anywhere?
Well, that's a light question to start with. Yes. Well, look, I think one example which ultimately speaks volume to the absence of an equivalent in other contexts is actually what you could define as the European response to people displaced from Ukraine. So you've had an unprecedented number in terms of the speed and the breadth of displacement happening essentially initially within a couple of weeks in the end of February, beginning of March last year from Ukraine, initially just to neighboring countries and then further afield within the European Union. And in a really rare and in fact unique instance of collaboration across borders and coming up with one uniform policy, the European Union activated a temporary protection directive, which allowed Ukrainians to receive protection in any of the EU member states and to receive various rights that attach to that status. And in fact, even the United Kingdom, which I'm sure we'll come to a bit later, which is currently adopting incredibly draconian policies in relation to people fleeing other places in the world, has been welcoming and has found what is a genuine safe and legal route for people to come from Ukraine through an online application system that allowed people to arrive. But the reality is modalities do exist. They are rare and they are inconsistent. And in most instances, whilst the number of people displaced is growing, the number of responses to that tend to be responses primarily in order to try and prevent people from arriving rather than offering them protection.
Right. I mean, Ruvi, you describe it as unique policy. Olga, we could also describe it as incredibly selective, that the policy with Ukraine is working quite effectively. But, for example, in the UK, people who are not going to arrive via the channel set out for Ukrainians, you have those arriving, for example, via the English Channel. And the UK now wants to immediately disqualify people arriving by boats that have crossed the English Channel. That seems to be the majority of what we're seeing as far as the more general immigration policy is concerned. So is that even legal? Is that the way countries should be developing their immigration policy?
Well, the example that was set by the response to the Ukraine war and the reception of refugees from Ukraine was exceptional, but it was not the only one or the first time that we were seeing something similar. Like, for instance, Colombia back in 2021 put in place a temporary protection status as well for those Venezuelans that were arriving, that allowed them to stay there for 10 years in something that was unique and is offering protection to millions of people still to date. So those are the examples that we want to see more often. Those are the examples that prove the regional responsibility sharing that is needed to respond to these growing numbers of people that are forced to flee. This is what we need to keep in mind. Like, no one takes the decision of leaving their home in this way if they are not forced to do so. In this case, by a growing and we are seeing a more dangerous world. We are seeing more crises, new crises that are developing that keep these numbers going higher and higher. And something that we keep on reminding states is their international responsibility to keep their borders open. It's good to put in place alternatives, other systems, alternative pathways so people can access safety without risking their lives through dangerous journeys. But it's important that they continue to keep territorial access to asylum available and accessible to those that are reaching the borders and seeking international protection.
Okay. Yeah, Ben, I'd like you to address what the UK has done or is trying to do, because they are trying to argue that people need to use, quote, safe and legal routes. But we're finding out that those safe and legal routes are in many ways just mythology, with some, 66% of people seeking legal entry, even for family reunification, are being rejected, then being forced to appeal, then having their asylum application in some cases eventually approved, but after a massively distressing process, many months, and sometimes a very expensive process, I should say as well, when they could just move more quickly and cost effectively, and it would be win-win.
I find that there's an extraordinary dissonance between the way UK immigration is reported in the press and the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation is that this government, the Conservative government that's been in power for the last 13 years, has taken in more migrants than the last Labour government or any government in history. We are at all-time record levels of immigration. We also have a higher asylum acceptance rate than occurred during the last Labour government as well. But the most important thing is that 13 years ago, the Conservative Party promised to reduce immigration of all kinds down to the tens of thousands and end illegal immigration altogether. 13 years later, they have missed that target by over 1,000%. The Home Secretary, the current Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has reconfirmed their commitment to that target. It has consistently been a top 3 concern of the British public, and their feeling that immigration has been far too high over the last 2 decades. And ultimately, in Britain, democracy and the democratic vote was to, as I say, reduce immigration to the tens of thousands, and that's what the government should be doing, but they're not. And so this idea that they're enacting draconian measures is ludicrous when you consider we have all-time high levels of migration into the UK.
Okay, Ruvi, you've looked exasperated. Why?
Well, I think for several reasons, frankly. The first is what your guest has just done. It was to conflate general migration policies, general migration on all types of grounds, work migration, family migration, students, etc., with the specific issue of asylum. So the pledges that he was referring to from Prime Minister Cameron and others were relating to what we refer to as voluntary or ordinary migration, and they had nothing to do and should have nothing to do with asylum. So that I think is a first important distinction. But hold on, I think the other important point is some of those figures that you quoted at the start related to what people are able to do once they are in the asylum process. So when Ben says that acceptance rates in the UK are high, that just suggests that people who apply for asylum in the UK are indeed have a genuine asylum claim. What the new legislation, what the illegal migration bill, very aptly named bill that's going through Parliament, intends to do is essentially not even offer them that chance. It says that if they arrive by small boat, if they are from Afghanistan, an Afghani woman arriving by boat across the channel, if they are from Sudan now, fleeing Sudan's war and trying to arrive across the channel, they will not even be allowed into the asylum system to have their day, as you were, in the court of the decision makers and then ultimately the courts of the United Kingdom. So I really don't understand, in a way, the logic of saying, well, we haven't met an arbitrary target around general migration, and so we want to clamp down on people who actually are in need of international protection.
Okay, Ben, I'll let you respond, and Olga, I'll come back to you. Ben, go ahead quickly.
Yes, when David Cameron proposed going up to the 2010 general election to reduce immigration to the tens of thousands, he didn't say apart from asylum claims. What he said was reduce the overall numbers of people coming into the country to the tens of thousands, which would include asylum claimants. I actually think that we should take the entirety of our national immigration quota per annum from asylum claimants, because they can do jobs just like any other economic migrant can do jobs. So it's not true to say that asylum wasn't part of that. It was always part of that. The British public feel that immigration of all kinds has been far too high. They don't want to see immigration above tens of thousands for any reason. including asylum, and they want to see illegal immigration end altogether. The dissonance exists is this pretense that the Conservative Party is somehow actually doing things to lower immigration. The Conservative Party have performed one of the biggest betrayals of the public and democracy in British history. And the reason they approve asylum claimants and let in, 1.2, 1.3 million migrants a year is because they love immigration. They love immigration more than the last Labour Party because it provides cheap labour, and that's their view of how to grow the overall size of the economy. The problem is the British public fundamentally disagree with them. They disagree with what the last Labour government did on immigration, and they want to see immigration come down to the tens of thousands.
Let me go back to Olga, because Olga, I mean, for as many good intentions as, organizations like the UNHCR and other NGOs will have to try and find safe ways for legitimate refugees and asylum seekers to get to safe countries, you're going to run into this wall of these national policies where governments have promised to keep numbers down. And it is remarkable, how we ended up here, given that just a few years ago, we all talked about globalization and how the world was kind of merging, and that we were going to see borders kind of disappear and more people were going to be crossing them and immigrating and emigrating. How did we end up here? How are we having this debate right now, whereby we're hearing the dislike in national policy for immigration?
One of the things that we need to keep in mind first is that sometimes we enter into this debate and we think that everyone wants to go to what we could say the richer or the most developed countries. And our figures, our data doesn't show that. Right. Like 76% of those refugees around the world are staying in low and middle income countries. And 70%, 7 out of 10 of the refugees, they stay in neighboring countries. Why is that? It's because they just want to be close to their homes. So as soon as there is peace, as soon as the conflict is solved, they can return to their communities. They can go back to their families and to their lives, because what these wars are doing are shattering these lives. Now, of course, there's people that are arriving to richer countries, and that's where we really call the states to ensure that there is that example that is set, that responsibility that is shared, and that countries just abide by the international obligations to just provide this protection to people that they don't have it in their place of origin at a specific moment. And it is true that sometimes we mix both conversations, one that is the one of the asylum system and the right and the obligation that the states have, the obligations that the states have to provide asylum to those fleeing war and persecution, and the migratory one. And that's why from UNHCR, but also other organizations, we're working with the states to make sure that the asylum systems become more efficient, but also that we make sure, and it's important, it's something that we always call for, is that there are additional legal pathways that are put in place, so people that don't need to seek asylum, they could just apply for those other alternatives like family reunification, other student visas, etc., and that those numbers and those realities are not diluted. And actually, the protection, the international protection that is required for refugees and others fleeing war and conflict can be ensured.
Right. I mean, Ruvi, they might be looking for solutions, but the truth is these numbers are probably going to get worse. We're not only up against, the conflicts that people are fleeing around the world, but now we know there are going to be potentially millions and millions of climate refugees. What's your outlook?
Yeah, well, so I think actually it is important to put numbers in context. So of the figure of over 100 million people are displaced globally, most people, nearly 60 million, are displaced within their own countries. And of those that are displaced outside their country, 3 countries have been the main generators of refugees, and those are Ukraine, Afghanistan, and Syria, and now increasingly Sudan. So we know that conflict, which is human conflict, right? Climate change is also human induced, but conflict of an armed nature is actually a very substantive cause of displacement across borders, and that is something that is within our control as humans, and it is something that we should try and minimize. Of course, the outcome of people having to flee to neighboring countries and beyond is an outcome of that failure to preserve relations between peoples. But on climate, ultimately, the refugee definition as it stands, which contrary again to a lot of populist speak, is actually pretty restrictive. It talks about persecution and it relates to specific persecutory grounds. In some instances will address climate-induced displacement, but in many it won't. And that doesn't mean, as a final point, it doesn't mean those people won't end up being displaced, because if they're forced to flee across a border, they will flee whether they fit the definition or not. And so the question, I think, for us, and the question for your other interviewees, is that given they are going to flee, should we continue to consider their plight illegal, or should we find ways of regularizing and addressing their predicament when they do?
Right. It seems like that question will continue to be asked. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to end our discussion there. For now, I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.